by saying thanks a lot for having us, guys, and giving us this opportunity to speak with you about marine biodiversity and particularly the incredible species that we share this area with, and uh, and to give you an idea of what we do around here. My name's Gary. I've been doing whale watching here for the past 10 years and different parts of the world as well, and Tass and I are both pretty passionate about it.
Yep, totally. So thank you so much, everybody, and a huge shout out and thank you to the Orca Conservancy for inviting us to be part of the National Biodiversity Teach-In. This is a really neat opportunity. I've never done anything quite this technologically detailed before, so this is really neat. And just a bit of just super brief personal history. I've been interested in killer whales and really all non-human life since I was really young, but have been whale watching here in British Columbia, in the northern Washington, the Salish Sea, for the last 7 years. And during the off season, Gary and I both participate in big killer whale research, and in addition, we try and go to other parts of the world during the long Canadian winter to go find marine life elsewhere. It's definitely a bit of an addiction. We really both live and breathe these animals, and one of the ways that we express our appreciation for them is through photography. So all of the images that you see in the presentation today are taken by either Gary or myself, unless otherwise noted. And I do illustrations of the animals as well, which I've thrown in the presentation here and there for you guys to enjoy. And on another note, we do have a cat in the house, so she may or may not join us at some point. So just a heads up on that. So we'll just briefly go through what we're kind of thinking for the presentation today, and at the end we would love to do a Q&A, so please put your thinking caps on and we'll answer those once we get to the end of the presentation. So just really quick overview of what the Salish Sea is and where it is, and whale watching in the area. And then Gary's going to give you guys a brief introduction to the biodiversity of killer whales all over the world, and then we'll get into what are the differences between the southern resident and the big killer whale, and then really the meat, so to speak, of the presentation will be our stories about the killer whales of the Salish Sea, and then of course why salmon are so important to this area. And we'll talk about some whale watching initiatives and why we find all of this so inspiring. But of course, before we get into the good stuff, where is the Salish Sea anyway? And of course, if you look under that big giant cloud, that would be where we are. It's famous for rain here. So the Salish Sea is a inland sea. We get cold water from the Pacific coming in twice a day with the tide. This is a transboundary area, so we're between Seattle, Vancouver, Vancouver Island. It's kind of half in Canada, half in the United States. The most recent process to form this area was the last ice age. The Coast Salish people have lived here for at least since the last ice age, and that's why we call it the Salish Sea. In terms of biodiversity, this place seriously has it all. There's over 3,000 different species that live in the Salish Sea. Anything from the largest octopus species in the world, the giant Pacific octopus. There are over 30 different species of rockfish here. Some of them live over 200 years old, it is thought. And there's even a giant sea slug that smells like watermelon, which is so incredible. So this is an amazing, diverse place. It's also very fragile. There are thought to be over 4 million people and counting that live along the shores of the Salish Sea, so it's at risk from urbanization, oil spills, fishing. So it's a very beautiful place, but it's also very fragile as well. So with all this biodiversity here, it's all amazing, and we're going to be focusing on the very, very top of the food chain, and that would be the killer whale or the orca. This photo is an amazing image that Gary took of a big killer whale that we call Chainsaw. This is him doing an amazing breach. Um, and the fact is, to get out and actually observe these animals, you do have to get on a boat, and we do that primarily through whale watching.
Yeah, that's right. And we work for a company here on Vancouver Island called Ocean Eco Ventures in a little town called Cowichan Bay. But we're actually part of a bigger association called the Pacific Whale Watch Association, which represents 33 companies. It's a professional organization and it's transboundary as well. So it's companies on both sides of the border that work together. And the reason why it was started was really to kind of streamline our presence on the water, make it a better experience for our passengers and also for the animals that we view as well. And like Tasli mentioned, there's incredible biodiversity throughout this entire area, specifically with marine mammals. We have 31 different species of marine mammals in British Columbia, which represents about a quarter of the global species. So that's pretty incredible. Now, we have a pretty amazing relationship with a lot of it today, but it wasn't always that way. Things have changed pretty dramatically in the last 60 years and 70 years. And this is just some of the biodiversity here that I'm showing you on this slide and some of the photos that we've taken. On the top left there, you can see sea otters, which are starting to make a huge comeback in British Columbia, but believe it or not, during the fur trade, those guys were hunted to local extinction. And then they were reintroduced once we figured out they were a keystone species in this area. So they've made a huge comeback. On the top right there, we have a humpback whale, which is another huge success story. You guys have all heard about whaling before, I'm sure, but these guys in the North Pacific were hit really hard and their population got as low as 1,400 animals. And now we're seeing more and more every year, and we're estimated to be close to 34,000 animals now in the North Pacific, which is just a great thing to see. And of course, we also have some Pacific white-sided dolphins there, and the biggest sea lions in the world, which we're treated to see quite regularly. They're called the Salish Sea lion, and they can weigh upwards of 2,000 pounds. So amazing sight to see and an amazing snack for killer whales, which is actually what we're going to talk about, because killer whales, today when we're out on the boat and we see a dorsal fin slicing through the water, we get really excited. But if we were to go back to like 1960 and prior to that, very different story. You'd be terrified. They're considered evil animals, partly because of their name. It's not the most flattering in the world. Killer whales came from the Spanish, who named them whale killers, because there is particular types of killer whales that will hunt and kill other whales. And when that translated into English, it converted to killer whale. So they got stuck with this bad reputation, this bad name. And I know a lot of you, if you've seen Blackfish, or you probably hear on the internet, call them Orca. It's so much nicer. Well, Orca actually comes from their Latin name, their genus and species, which is Orcinus orca. Roughly translated means whale from the underworld of the dead. So either way you look at it, pretty bad reputation. So just to kind of paint a picture for you, in 1961 in British Columbia, there's government law to shoot killer whales on sight. Believe it or not, there's even a machine gun mounted on an island called Quadra Island, not far from here, that was designed to shoot killer whales coming south so they'd never get close to the town of Campbell River. Now, that gun was never fired because of the chance of ricocheting bullets hitting people, so they shut that down. But the fact that it was there alone shows you how different our relationship with killer whales was back then. So I want to tell you guys a little bit how we got from basically this movie on the left here called Orca, the killer whale, this vicious killing machine, and all of a sudden in 1993 we got Free Willy. So it's a huge change, very dramatic, and in a short amount of time. And the reason why this all started was in 1964. The Vancouver Aquarium here in BC decided they wanted to build a sculpture of a killer whale to show people this animal, this vicious beast. And they figured the best way to do that would be to come out here, kill one, and collect it, and they could use it as a basis for their sculpture. So they commissioned some guys to do this, and they set up on an island called Saturn Island, which we pass all the time on our whale watching trips, and particularly a point called East Point. And East Point it's a very good place for land-based whale watching. Resident killer whales, which Tasli will introduce you to in a little bit, they're very predictable in their patterns for the most part, and at this particular place, they usually tend to travel very close to shore. So you can see on the top photo here, these guys have been sitting waiting for the whales to come by. They had to wait for about 3 weeks, but eventually in July 1964, on the very bottom left there, you can see the whales came and they were successful at harpooning a young animal. But what they saw next really shocked them. They actually saw the family members of this individual come up and start holding it above the surface and assisting it. So they realized two things. They realized, one, this animal was a lot more complex than we initially thought, and two, they might be able to bring it back to the city alive, which they were successful at doing so amazingly. And you can see on the bottom right there, that whale held in a little pen in the Vancouver harbor. And through a radio contest, he got the name Moby Doll. And it really paints a picture of how little we knew about killer whales, because they called him Moby Doll thinking it was a female because it was a small fin. Later on, they found out it was just an adolescent male or a juvenile male. But Moby Doll really changed the world. All of a sudden, people from all over the world were coming to see this animal that was held in Vancouver. It made front page news in Britain. It spread all over the world, and he really changed everything. Unfortunately, we didn't know how to take care of a killer whale. They were trying to feed him weird things like chicken and beef and pieces of whale blubber, stuff you find lots of in the sea apparently. And sooner or later, they figured out he liked fish, go figure, particularly salmon. So unfortunately, Moby Doll only survived 3 months before dying of a lung infection, but that's all it took. And it's a real testament to how incredible this animal is, that it only took 3 months to change the world's perception on killer whales. And now, of course, we're going to talk about captivity a little bit later, because Moby Doll really sparked that as well. But what he also sparked was the research front, and people wanted to learn more about these animals. And this is just an illustration, an amazing illustration by Ugo Gorder, showing different types of killer whales in the southern and northern hemisphere and how different they can look. And it's not just their physical differences, but what we know now is killer whales are the most widely distributed mammal on the planet next to humans. So everywhere you go around the world, every ocean, you will find killer whales. And everywhere you go, they're different. They have different foods and cultures and languages and even cultural activities. And as you can see here, physical appearances of some of the Antarctic ones there on the left can look pretty gnarly. But the ones that we're really focused on are these two on the top right here. So top right is our resident killer whales, and just below that are called Biggs killer whales, or formerly called transient killer whales. And as far as their range goes in the summertime, because for our purposes, that's mostly when we're out there. We do get out there occasionally in the winter, but it's mostly the spring, summer, and fall. And you can see historically the southern resident killer whale, their range is quite a bit smaller than the Biggs killer whale, which can stretch over 3,000 miles along the west coast of North America in search of food, whereas the residents tend to be a lot more condensed, which was great for whale watching, but back in the 60s and 70s was not so great when it came to captivity. And again, we'll talk about that a little bit later on. Now, if you look at them, you might look at this and just see a bunch of fins and white patches, but if you look closer, you can really start to see the difference. And on the top row, it's all what we call Biggs killer whales. And we used to call them transients, and I should maybe address that when we first started studying them, not us, but this guy by the name of Dr. Michael Bigg, he really pioneered killer whale research. And he mostly studied the animals on the bottom row, as you can see they're called resident killer whales. And Tasley's going to explain their family structure a little bit later, but they do act a lot different than the Biggs killer whales on top. So every once in a while, these Biggs killer whales would show up, and he would just call them oddballs. But now we know that they're quite a bit different. He called them transients initially because he wouldn't see the same ones for years and just figured that they were going somewhere very far away. It just turns out that they have a bigger range. So transient was not really an appropriate name for them, so we've recently renamed them to Biggs killer whales in memory of Dr. Michael Bigg, who we really owe the fact that we still have killer whales here to him. So if you look closer on the top row, you can see the Biggs killer whales all tend to have closed saddle patches, whereas on the bottom, the saddle patch, by the way, is the white patch just below the fin, whereas the resident killer whales tend to, not all the time, but they have a lot of open saddle patches as well. You can see those little wispy black marks inside the saddle patch. So we're just going to show you, we go to the next slide, and we've identified these animals for you, and feel free to take a look here and see all the differences between them. And on the top left there, that's one of our favorites, T170s, one of the craziest looking whales that we have out here, Biggs killer whales. And here's just for to illustrate our point a little bit more how different they can be. We showed you that photo of chainsaw belly flopping earlier. There he is again on the top right. Scoter on the bottom right there with his really broad dorsal fin. It really makes him easy to recognize. Obviously, L25 Ocean Sun on the bottom left there. You can see why she's so recognizable. And T65A on the top left, you can just see that real subtle nick near the top of her fin, which makes her easy to recognize as well.
All right, so there's physical differences between bigs and southern resident killer whales, but arguably the big difference between the two populations is their diet. And really a lot of the other differences that we see between the two populations is, we think, a result of their hunting strategy and therefore what their diet is. So their vocalizations are different, their family size, and like Gary just went over, their physical appearance, with the big killer whale typically being a little bit more banged up with more notches, more scars, which we often attribute to battles that they've had with their prey. So the top image is a photo that Gary took of kind of a fan favorite, of definitely a fan favorite whale in the Salish Sea, T137A, or Jack, as he is known, and he's pictured there with basically lunch. That would be a Pacific harbor seal, right precariously close to Jack's mouth. So the Jack is a part of what we call the West Coast transient or big killer whale population. There's about 250 of them, and they'll eat seals, stellar and California sea lions, harbor porpoise, Dahl's porpoise, Pacific white-sided dolphins, and even sometimes large baleen whales such as minke whale, which are almost the same size or sometimes slightly larger than a killer whale, so it's quite a prey to take down. They do not eat fish, as far as we know. They are marine mammal hunters. So Jack is going to eat this harbor seal. It didn't survive, let me tell you. And it's their most common prey in this area are the harbor seals, and that's likely due to just the sheer abundance of harbor seals in this area. In fact, in the Salish Sea, we have the highest, some of the most highest densities of harbor seals anywhere on the coast here, so it's a bit of a bonanza. But also harbor seals don't exactly have the ability to run away like a porpoise can, so you could say that they're a bit of an easier meal. But Jack would have worked together with his mother and his siblings to bring this seal down. It's actually quite hard work for killer whales to even catch something as cute as a seal. They're very wily and they do fight back. So they do have to work together. And Jack here is basically a full-size male. He probably has a bit more growing to do, but when a male killer whale is fully grown, we call them a bull, and they're usually in the neighborhood of about 10,000 pounds, which is basically the weight of 3 cars, just to put it into perspective. And Jack will eat about 375 pounds of food a day. That wouldn't be totally outrageous, which if we put that into human terms, that's like eating about 725 tacos in a single day, which is quite significant. Now on the bottom, we see a southern resident killer whale. This is an adult female that we call J37, or Haishka is her nickname. And you can see there that she's got a nice big salmon right in front of her that she's bashing out of the water after chasing it. So southern resident killer whales have no interest in eating seals or porpoises or any marine mammal. They are highly selective about what they eat, and they specialize in salmon, but even more specifically Chinook salmon, which can account for 80% or more of their diet during the summer. So that's one species of salmon, which it would be kind of like eating Cheerios every meal of every day, almost every day of the week. So they're highly specialized, and some people sometimes compare them to panda bears, which of course famously eat almost exclusively, if not only, bamboo. So as you can imagine, such a specialized diet means that if their prey, the Chinook salmon, disappear, these southern resident killer whales are in trouble. And indeed they are. The southern resident killer whales are considered endangered in both Canada and the United States. They're currently in a situation where they're not really recovering. We only have 76 of them left. It's a 30-year low for the population. We will talk a little bit more about that later on, but just to finish up this photo of Haishka eating this salmon, she'll eat around 200 pounds of salmon in a day. So this is one of several fish that she'll hopefully be eating that particular day. And to put it into a bit of perspective, over the summer, the entire population of southern residents, if they're all in the Salish Sea on the same day, they'll eat around 1,200 salmon in one day. So again, having a lot of salmon is paramount for these animals. We'll move on. Oh, but before we do, of course, I had to throw this photo in here. It's kind of a fun one. This is a young 3-year-old Big's killer whale, T86A3, cruising by the boat with basically a harbor seal's butt in its mouth. It's its hind flippers, and it's not uncommon for the young Big's killer whale, and actually the southern residents as well, to pass bits of food back and forth to each other and seemingly play with it. So it's pretty cool. The vocalizations, believe it or not, are very different between southern resident and Big's killer whales, and what they're preying on has really dictated what they sound like and how much these whales say. So the Big's killer whale are typically much quieter, and we suspect that that's to avoid being detected by the seals and the porpoises and the sea lions that they're hunting, which have very acute hearing. So as soon as they hear a Big's killer whale, they're getting out of the water if they can. The southern resident killer whales, on the other hand, are quite famous for being rather chatty Cathies. So it's not just the amount that they vocalize, it's actually their entire repertoire of calls is different. It's basically 2 different languages that they speak. It's quite remarkable. And hopefully we can get Kyle here to play the audio recording of the southern resident killer whales. Okay.
Perfect.
Okay, that was really cool. So that was a recording of actually a big group of southern resident killer whales calling all together. Quite excited sort of behavior. Now see if you can pick up some of the differences between those southern resident calls and these Big's killer whale calls, which hopefully Kyle can play for us here.
Maybe.
They do sound a little bit like cats. I'm sorry if that startled your dog again, Giles. So in both of those cases, those were pretty chatty whales. The Big's killer whales usually are very silent. So when we do get a chance to record them talking, Gary and I get really excited. So very neat. So now that we have kind of a general understanding about the whales' diets and their travel patterns and what they sound like, you might be wondering where these names and numbers are coming from that we're throwing out. So Gary mentioned Dr. Michael Bigg earlier in the talk. So he was a pioneering killer whale biologist in British Columbia. And when he began to count and study the killer whales in the 1970s, he assigned each whale a letter and a number. So this picture might look a little bit confusing right now, but I'll try and break it down. Within the southern resident population, there are 3 pods, which we call J, K, and L pod. And each pod is a group of families or matrilines that travel together, and they have similar calls that they share, sort of like an accent. This particular pod, J pod, is the most commonly encountered pod in the Salish Sea, and all of this data comes from the Center for Whale Research on San Juan Island, which have been doing an annual census of these whales for the last 40 plus years. So they're the folks that really know these whales better than anybody. It's actually part of the longest ongoing census of any marine mammal anywhere in the world. And by the way, the little gray boxes that you see are what Ken Balcom from the Center for Whale Research calls tombstones. And they represent whales that have passed away since the census began. And if you look closely, you might note that these are matrilineal groups or matrilineal families, which means that the mother, and in some cases the grandmother, is at the head of the family. And all of her offspring, male or female, will actually travel with her the entirety of their life, which is actually rather unique. So we'll just zoom in on one family or matriline in particular within J-pod, if you're managing to keep up with this. This is the J16 matriline. So we also call it Slick's family because in addition to their ID number that researchers give them, people here in the Salish Sea really adore these animals, and we give them kind of pet names. So this is Slick. She's the matriarch or the mother of this family, and she currently has 4 offspring. So Mike, J26, is her eldest, and her youngest is little J50 or Scarlet, who you can see on the far right side of the frame. And something really exciting happened to the J16s in kind of late 2014, early 2015. They went from a family of 4 to a family of 6 in roughly 3 months' time. So Slick had a baby, she had little Scarlet, and her daughter Alki also had a baby, and we called him Sonic. So I just think of this as like, imagine if this happened in a human family where all of a sudden you went from having no babies in the house to all of a sudden 2. Gosh, it's a lot to handle. So it was a very exciting time here for whale watchers in the Salish Sea because we had gone nearly 2 years without a successful calf, and then all of a sudden we had 2 of them, and in fact there was more. So I did this illustration to commemorate the moment because it was very exciting. So if we take a little bit closer look at one of those calves, this is Scarlet, and you can see she's got some sort of white scrapes on her back and on her dorsal fin. We call those rake marks, and those are made by the teeth of other killer whales in Scarlet's skin, and it's a big mystery as to why she has these, but it was fairly clear that she had them when she was very young. She had them when she was first seen at just a few days or weeks old. And there's some speculation that it could have been a case of a killer whale midwife basically stepping in and helping Slick give birth to Scarlet, maybe actually physically pulling her from the womb. It's speculation, of course, there's no way to prove that, but it is very unusual that she has these rake marks, and it's actually a plausible thing to speculate because Scarlett's mother, Slick, is relatively old, and she's kind of getting to the stage where we expect her to not have any more calves. They'll go through menopause at around between age 40 and 45 or thereabouts, and that's actually worth noting because killer whales are not quite unique, almost unique in that they can live decades beyond their ability to reproduce and give birth, which seems normal to us because we are humans and that's how we are. Females live well beyond their ability to reproduce, but it's not common in the animal kingdom. As far as I know, there's only 3 known species where this is the case: pilot whales, killer whales, and humans. So we might learn more about that later on, but definitely worth noting. But of course, as it seems so often with the southern residents, tragedy followed this really good news. So Slick's little grandson, Sonic, seemed to be doing really well. He was growing up strong alongside of his family, or so it seemed, and he made it past his critical first year, in which there's a fairly high chance that they don't make it through their first year, but he did. And then all of a sudden he died when he was just barely 2 years old, and we'll never know what happened precisely, but tragically it's becoming a trend that the young animals are not living as long as previous generations. And one thing that we can look at in terms of this is that killer whales are at the very top of the food chain, and a lot of the man-made chemicals that we use in manufacturing and all kinds of industry and agriculture, it gets into the ocean and it accumulates the higher you go up the food chain. So animals like a killer whale, very top of the food chain, they tend to have quite a burden of these man-made synthetic chemicals in their systems, particularly when it comes to their fat cells. And killer whale's milk is very high in fat indeed. So unfortunately, the mothers are passing on a lot of these chemicals through their milk into their offspring, and Sonic was the first known offspring of Alki. So there's a possibility that she offloaded a significant amount of chemicals into Sonic, and that could have been his undoing, but like I said, we'll never know. By the way, guys, thank you so much for some of these questions. I will definitely get to them at the end, so thank you.
I am writing them down, so we'll address them later.
Yes, thank you. But
okay, so well, Tasli's really touched on the southern residents and kind of the difficulty they're facing. And in regards to that bioaccumulation, what's really interesting is the other type of killer whales, which we see here, the Biggs killer whales, are one step higher on the food chain than the residents. So therefore, their toxins would be estimated to be higher, but their population is over 250 and roughly growing at 4% a year. So the thought is the main difference for these guys is, like Tasli touched on earlier, they're feeding on seals and sea lions and dolphins and stuff that's quite abundant around here. So lots of food, so all these toxins get stored in their blubber, but they tend to stay there, whereas the southern residents are tending to break down those fats if there's a lack of food. But Tasli showed you that MATRILINE breakdown. The Biggs killer whales, although their social orientation is a little bit different, the kind of core of it is the same. It's a matriarchal group, and I just picked one family from our ID guide here, so just excuse all the scribbling and writing, but this is called the T100 family tree. And it's a family that one of my first Biggs killer whales families I ever saw here when I started in 2007. And back then it was just a small family of 4. It was T100 at the top there, so you can see that's her. And then we have T100B, which was her first daughter, T100C, and T100E. So it was just the 4 of them. And, oh, the screen is frozen. Okay, let's see if they can fix that. But, so it was just the 4 of these whales that were together. And T100, since I've started, she has had another calf in 2014, T100F. Now, what happens in the big killer whale groups? If you're a resident killer whale, like Cass mentioned, you're going to stay with your family your entire life. But a big killer whale family, you don't want to travel in these large groups because you're going to give away your location to all of your prey. Seals and sea lions and dolphins, they're pretty smart and they're going to see you coming. So it makes a lot more sense to travel in small, stealthy groups. So there seems to be a critical point, sort of around the 4 to 7 animal range, where there'll be a little bit of dispersal. And I'll talk about that in a second. But just to kind of show you how much this family's changed, like I said, when I started this family, it was a group of 4. And now we're looking at a group of 5, 6, 7. So it's quite a bit larger. But I'm going to zoom in on this guy right here, T100C. You can see here he's got a pretty small fin, and just like his sister there with a little notch in the middle. But as he's grown up, because right now he's 16 years old, once killer whales reach about 12 years old, they both go through maturity, but males, their fin will start to grow. And you can see here, this is a shot I got of him just a couple of years ago, but T100C is what we call a sprouter. So he's in those teenage years where he's starting to get bigger and bigger, and that fin will eventually grow to a full 6 foot or 2 meters high. And he's a pretty awesome whale, like one of our favorites as well, because, you know, to be honest, all the young teenage whales, they're just like humans. They kind of goof around a little bit more, which is a lot of fun when you're watching them. And here's a few more shots of him. In this top photo, he's kind of in the middle, wedged right between mom there and between 2 other males from the T101 family. And on the bottom, there's him goofing around, one doing a dorsal slap on the bottom left, and that classic West Coast breach on the bottom right. But the real interesting thing over the past few years is the T100B. So what we notice with this dispersal that happens is it's typically the oldest female offspring that will leave the group. The males, although they're the biggest and probably the most impressive looking, they're all big mama's boys, and they're going to stay with mom forever. For the most part, there are some exceptions, but it's usually the oldest female offspring that splits, and that's the case with this T100 group. So T100B has dispersed a couple of years ago with her own 2 offspring, T100B1 and T100B2, which she had in 2016. And it seemed to be that they really dispersed in 2016 after the second calf. They do come together every once in a while with the rest of the family as well, but for the most part, they're on their own. And like I mentioned, this was after her second calf in 2016, and this is the second calf here, T100B2. And you can see it's got that orangey tinge as well, which we'll address later in the questions. So to go back to kind of Moby Doll, when I was talking about him, Moby Doll changed the world and changed the global perception of killer whales, but he also sparked the captivity trade because, of course, a lot of marine parks were seeing all these people that were flocking in to see him and thought, hey, why don't we have one of these in a tank? And lots of people pay money to come see them. So the top bid for Moby Doll was actually $25,000, which seems like a lot, but they go for millions now. So between the years of 1964 to 1975, we had approximately 50 killer whales taken from these waters, and that's not including ones that escaped or died during the captures, so it's probably a lot higher than that. Now, the majority of those were resident killer whales, because I did mention earlier how they typically travel in that more condensed area, larger groups, easier to spot, and therefore easier to catch. The big killer whales, not as much, but this particular case, in March 1976, was 6 big killer whales that were captured down in Puget Sound in a place called Butt Inlet, and they became famously known as the Butt Inlet 6. Bigger. So these animals were commissioned to be captured by SeaWorld, and they were captured, they were held in net pens, they were herded into a little bay with underwater explosives. It was a pretty gruesome industry that was going on. But thankfully, this was during the time of really people were starting to change their minds on captivity. This is kind of where it all started. And there was a group in Washington that decided that this was unacceptable, and a bunch of lawyers got together and started to work on a case to free these animals. And it was amazing. They were successful, and all 6 of these animals were released back into the wild. You can see this one that's already up in a sling there, but she was back in the wild and swimming free again. Now, one of those whales is a whale that we get to see quite regularly, and she's in the foreground here. T46 was famously part of the Butt Inlet 6. And one whale can make a huge difference. And because of her, we have 17 additional wild killer whales as a result. So those are whales that are directly from her and their offspring. So it just goes to show you how important one whale is to the big picture out here. And you can see her in the foreground here beside T65A, and on the far side, T122, who is her presumed daughter. And here's some of her kids now. So this is T46D. It's her oldest son. This is this summer. He's just about to break the surface. I love that, just before the surface tension breaks the whale. You know, if I showed you a picture of him from the side, you wouldn't think he's 18. He's kind of a runt. His little brother is actually quite a bit bigger, T46E, who's right here. He's 15 years old, and you can see he's a pretty voracious hunter and pretty proud of it too. On the bottom there, that's him this summer near East Point, actually, where Moby Doll was harpooned. That's where this was taken, and he's parading around his porpoise catch. That's his lunch for the day to share with his family. And their youngest, which is T46F, and that's her youngest one, 5 years old, quite exuberant as well. And you can see he's pretty stoked here after a big successful seal hunt down off Victoria. So getting into captivity a little bit more, I mentioned about 50 whales were taken, but the vast majority of those were southern residents, and roughly there's about 45 southern residents that were taken from these waters. Now, we don't know exactly what the population was back then, but it's estimated that was roughly a third of the population, which is huge. And if you guys have all heard of Shamu, I'm sure, the first Shamu came from the southern resident pods. So now, taking a third of the population, if you're taking whales that were old and males and young, it still is terrible, but it wouldn't have as much of an effect as it did, because they weren't going after those whales, they were going after the young ones. Because for two reasons: one, they were easier to transport, and two, they would last longer in captivity. So it really hit this population hard. There's huge generation gaps, and that's partly why there's only 76 animals left in this population. And we're going to address, obviously, the other issues later on. But thankfully, the world seems to be changing, and we're going to talk a little bit about social media later as well, and how it's really changed the world, and the voice for these whales has gotten louder and louder. And now places like SeaWorld are ending their program, as well as, you guys probably heard, the Vancouver Aquarium is now committed to not having any whales or dolphins in their facility anymore, which is great to see. Now, all the whales that were taken back in the 60s and 70s, all of them from the southern residents have passed away except for one. And Lolita kind of breaks the mold. Most captive killer whales don't have that long of a lifespan, but Lolita, or we call her here Tokate, she's been there since 1970 in Miami, Florida, at the Miami Sea Aquarium, and you can just see on the bottom left there how small her home is for her. It's kind of a sad picture. Now, Lolita, she's kind of unique in the sense that a lot of the wild killer whales that were captured, we don't really know where they came from or who their family was, but with the southern residents being one of the most studied groups of whales on the planet, we actually have a pretty good idea of who her mother is. And on the top left there, that's L25, or Ocean Sun, who's now in her 80s, and she is the presumed mother of Tokate. So it would be great one day. Believe me, there's a lot of public pressure to make this happen, to have a retirement pen for her on the west side of San Juan Island, where she could come and feel the tides again, and maybe even have a chance to interact with her family again. So fingers crossed for that.
So this whole period of time where killer whales were being captured is thankfully in the past, but it has had this very intense ripple effect through the southern resident population. But they face new problems now. It's not just all dandy that we've stopped capturing them and they're fine now. They face other threats. And when we talk about modern threats to these whales, certainly their lack of prey that's available to them is arguably the biggest problem that they face currently. And we can really see that in fairly close detail when we look at J32, or Rhapsody as she was known. Again, she was a fan favorite out here as well. She was quite often seen breaching like this, which is obviously spectacular to see. It's a very special moment, and for whatever reason, Rhapsody seemed to do this more often than other whales. Of course, they all have different personalities, and this was apparently part of her personality. Her entire family history is just kind of fraught with tragedy. She lost her mother, her grandmother, and her older brother, basically all of her closest family, all within a very short period of time, just a few years, when she was herself was quite young. And she ended up being adopted by her auntie, J22, or Oreo. And so she traveled with Oreo and her cousins for the rest of her life. So it's just kind of one thing after the other with Rhapsody. I took this photo of Rhapsody doing her usual exuberant breaching in June of 2014. And if you look really closely at her tummy, you may or may not be able to see a small baby bump there. And we rarely get an insight like this, but Rhapsody breached so often that we actually got sort of multiple shots of her belly, and it was enough information to make most people think that she was pregnant, a little 400-pound bun in the oven, so to speak. So everybody in the whale watching community here was really excited and very joyful, not only for the prospect of a much needed calf in this imperiled population, but also because this was Rhapsody's first known calf. But just 5 months after this photo was taken, this happened. She died at age 18 with a full-term fetus inside of her. And I know this is an upsetting photo to see. It's actually quite rare for these whales to wash up post-mortem, and I know we've had a couple questions about autopsies of these animals, and the fact is we very rarely get a chance to do a necropsy or an animal autopsy on them. So it was a unique but very upsetting opportunity that Rhapsody actually washed up in December of 2014 on Vancouver Island. So losing a prime age reproductive female with a full-term calf was a very sharp blow, considering that a chronic lack of food has led these whales to be less successful in carrying calves to full term and also to survive into adulthood. In Rhapsody's case, it is very likely that this was just kind of one of those situations where it just didn't work. She was unable to give birth to the calf, which does happen sometimes in nature. But when we add this tragedy in with the lack of food that they experience, it's just it's kind of a lot to handle. So this graph, I know it's a little bit confusing to look at. This is courtesy of the Center for Whale Research again, and it actually provides a very powerful insight into the relationship between southern resident killer whales and Chinook salmon. So if you take a look along the very top of the graph, there are purple bars, and the longer that purple bar is, the more whales died that particular year. The years are listed on the bottom of the graph. And all of those colorful peaks and valleys that you see, those are all indicating numbers of Chinook salmon in different rivers in British Columbia, Washington, and California. So if you look at the parts where the bars go up really high, you'll notice that the purple bars are shorter, which means fewer whales died in the years where there was more salmon available to them. And it's quite obvious when you look in the middle of the graph where the salmon abundance is overall the lowest. We saw the most numbers of killer whale deaths, and this is not the only data that shows relationships like this between southern resident killer whales and Chinook salmon. we do have a saying around here. We say no fish, no blackfish. And here is some science to back up that saying, certainly. So critical link between the two species.
Yeah, which is why when we're out on the water, it's important that we respect the whale's space and we have rules and regulations to follow to make sure that these guys can go about their natural life processes, because these guys, more so than the bigs, are relying on echolocation or biosonar to find fish. So they're releasing pulses of sound out into the environment that bounces off objects in the environment. Hopefully a big Chinook salmon comes back to them where they receive that echo in their hollow lower jaw, and it goes up through their inner ear and produces an image in their brain of what they're looking at. And it's pretty incredible, actually. These guys are able to distinguish between different types of salmon blindfolded. So it's an incredible sonar system. And that's why partly here in the Pacific Northwest, we developed sets of guidelines to abide by for the Pacific Whale Watch Association. And these are actually currently being amended to make them a little even more strict as research gets better and better. But you can see the 100 or 200 yard no-go zone around the whales. You give them that space and go no more than about 5 knots. So these are steps that we're taking to make sure we don't impact the whales out there. But being out there, we want to make sure that we're giving back as well. So what we try to do in our boats, and actually most of the companies, we're trying to deliver a good message that people can take home with them. So we're trying to give them the tools to help these animals. And here in the Pacific Northwest, we take out between 400 and 500,000 guests per year, and that's between all 33 companies. And we're all on the same page with the salmon story, trying to tell people what kind of help these animals need. And also what we started the last few years is what we call a conservation fee. So most companies now are taking a portion of their ticket sales and donating it back towards research projects, salmon enhancement projects. And in the past few years, we've raised over $1 million and donated that back to nonprofits and research groups, et cetera. And, even more simply than that, just being on the water, when we're with whales, we're kind of setting the bar for what to do. So it's a real responsibility on us as operators to make sure that we are being a positive example for people out on the water, because this is a very, very popular area, not just for whale watchers, but also for recreational fishermen, for people just boating around. So when they come across a group of whales, it's good for us to set a positive example for them. And like Tasli mentioned at the beginning, we do collaborate with, we do work with certain research groups and give them information regarding these whales, because it is expensive to be on the water every day as a research operator. So for us being out there every day, we can provide important information to them regarding what's going on out there with the whales.
Okay, so what is a picture of a pigeon doing in here, you might be wondering, but the National Biodiversity Teach-In that we are all taking part in right now was inspired by this pigeon. This is Martha. She was the very last passenger pigeon to ever exist on Earth. And she's significant because her kind was wiped out solely due to the actions of human beings. And this is very surprising when you consider that passenger pigeons were very likely the most numerous bird on Earth at one time, or among the most numerous. They were so numerous that people would write about them flying in flocks that were hundreds of miles long, and that they would block out the sun when they passed, and they would land in trees to roost at night, and the trees would crack and the branches would fall off because there were so many of them. They were basically hunted mercilessly and wastefully until all of them but Martha were destroyed. And when she died in 1914, that was it. And so I think she's a real testament to the destructive power that we have over other living beings, but also represents hope that we can change. And if we take the time to learn about individual creatures, their population, the biodiversity that they fit into, but also as individuals, I think we can really make positive change. And I'm hopeful that these amazing southern resident killer whales will be cherished enough that we can protect them, because it's too late for the passenger pigeon, and hope maybe not too late for the southern residents.
Yeah, and that's why we take such, this is a great quote to our kind of our mantra on the water, because we believe it's really important to tell people what's going on out here with these animals and to give them those tools to then take home with them. And things like, it doesn't have to even be huge things. You know, we talk about salmon quite a bit, so a lot of people don't know that farm salmon is terrible for the environment out here. The way that farming is done in open net farms in the West Coast is killing off wild populations, and I hope some of you got a chance to see Alex Morton's talk this morning, because I'm sure it was wonderful regarding that, so I'm not going to get into that too much, but you know, avoiding farm salmon, making sure you're using sustainable seafood programs, things like Ocean Wise and Seafood Watch. I'm sure all of you guys have smartphones. You can download these apps for free. So if you like to eat seafood, make sure you're making sustainable seafood choices. And then even simple things, you know, when we go off the water as well, when we go to a restaurant for dinner, sometimes we'll ask for no, watch, we always ask for no straw in our drink. And inevitably you get the question, why? And then we tell people about, well, you know, in the US alone, 500 million straws are used today, every day, and that plastic takes thousands of years to break down. And all of a sudden, these restaurants in Cowichan Bay are no longer giving straws just because education. And we believe it's a really valuable thing. So that's what we're trying to do with people out here, and the response from people on and off the water has just been overwhelming. So I guess, like, for us, we can just tell you to, you know, do your part. Every little bit helps. Try to help these animals, and one person does make a difference. And T46 is a good example of that. You know, it's one whale. Now there's 17 additional ones in the water. So do your part, and hopefully the southern resident killer whales can become a story like the sea otters and like the humpbacks here on our coast, and our big killer whales can continue to flourish as they're doing now. And this is just some of the other, I just want to throw these in quickly. It's not just about killer whales. The biodiversity on this coast, it's so important for tons of different species. In the top right, of course, black bear. The bottom right, we have bald eagles, which there's tons of them around here who heavily rely on salmon. Bottom left is one I took a couple years ago of grizzlies feeding in the Orford River just north of here. But that's a mama grizzly bear chewing into a chum salmon, and her little cub there watching and learning how it's done. And the top left one is not actually showing, there's a humpback whale there, but it's actually talking about the forests in the background, because salmon are incredible species. I mean, some of them migrate hundreds of miles upriver before spawning and dying, and it releases so many nutrients and nitrogen into the soil, and provides food for all these trees growing. So it's really important to look after the salmon. But of course, for our own interest and because of how amazing they are, we want to continue seeing sites like this. This is one of the favorite shots from this past season that I captured of my favorite whale, J27 Blackberry. He's a pretty charismatic individual, and that's one thing we're really privileged to do, is to be able to get to know the animals individually, not just to be recognizing them, but also to see their personalities. And it's a privilege for us to do something like this, and also on the water every day, to be a voice for these animals who can't really stand up for themselves. So yeah, so I just want to say thanks a lot. And if you guys have any further questions, I just wanted to put up this here. Tasli and I find that social media has been an incredible tool. I mean, we all know it can be really terrible at times, but also it creates a united voice. And ever since the introduction of the social media, the voice has gotten louder and louder, and people from all over the world can be engaged in this fight. And you can see it now with captivity ending, and we continue to educate people and show them through our photography and artwork, and we choose to use Instagram mostly. So if you guys want to follow, feel free to go ahead and follow some of our stuff.
Thank you so much, you guys. Oh man, I knew we would talk too long. If you guys have questions and we can't answer them right now, which I don't think we're going to be able to, please get in touch with us. Just hop on Instagram. All of our contact info is there. And yeah, thank you. This has been really fun.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.